Case 1. The Savoy Ballroom, Harlem. Summer night, 1935. The air thick enough to taste. Sweat, cologne, cigarette smoke, curling toward a ceiling that's seen 1,000 secrets. Duke Ellington's fingers are dancing across ivory keys, his orchestra swelling behind him like a wave about to break. The floor is packed, bodies moving in that synchronized chaos only Harlem knows how to conduct. Shoes snapping against polished wood, laughter cutting through brass. This is sacred ground. Then the bottle goes up. Champagne. Expensive. The kind outsiders bring when they want everyone to know they don't belong, but have the money to pretend they do. The man holding it, loud, drunk, wrong energy from the moment he walked in, aims it like a weapon. Not at the ceiling, not at his crew, at Duke Ellington, mid-song. The spray catches the stage lights. How it turns golden for half a second, then hits the Duke square in the face. The music stops. Not a fade, a cut. Like someone ripped the needle off the record of the universe. 500 people holding their breath at once makes a sound. It's the sound of a line being crossed. Duke freezes, liquid dripping from his jaw, his tailored suit, his dignity. He doesn't move, doesn't speak. Because in 1935, America, a black man, no matter how famous, no matter how brilliant, has to calculate every reaction. One wrong move and the headlines write themselves. But here's the thing about Harlem. It has its own enforcement mechanisms. And in the back of that ballroom, leaning against the wall in a suit sharper than the silence, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, just saw everything. What happens when you humiliate Harlem's crown jewel in front of 500 witnesses? You're about to find out. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Let me know if you've ever heard this story before. To understand why what just happened matters, you need to understand what Harlem was running on in 1935. Cash. But not the kind that passed through banks with marble floors and men in wireframe glasses who looked at you like you were already guilty of something. This was street cash, envelope cash, the kind that moved through hands, not ledgers. The Great Depression had gutted the country, but it hit black neighborhoods like a targeted strike. Jobs, scarce, wages, lower than low, housing. You paid twice what white folks paid for half the space, and 10 times the disrespect. The mainstream economy had doors, sure, but they were locked, guarded, or rigged to slam on your fingers. So Harlem built its own. The numbers racket wasn't just gambling. It was infrastructure. You placed a bet for pennies, dreamed on a number, and maybe you hit. But even when you didn't, that system kept the neighborhood breathing. A numbers runner could make a living. A small business could survive on credit, extended by someone who didn't ask for paperwork, only loyalty. A family could float through a bad month because someone remembered their address and slipped an envelope under the door. Picture a widow getting coal in February because a runner remembered her address. That's what the numbers were. Hope sold retail. Survival sold wholesale. Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen, understood this better than anyone. She wasn't just some woman in a red dress with a sharp tongue, though she had both. She was a political actor. She wrote letters, applied pressure, leveraged the only weapons available to a black woman with power in a segregated city: reputation, community ties, and a willingness to embarrass officials who preferred to operate in the shadows. She represented something simple and dangerous: local control over local revenue. Outsiders looked at Harlem and saw easy money. Harlem looked at the numbers and saw its money. And when someone tries to take what's yours, you don't call the cops. Because the cops aren't coming to help. You call someone else. What time is it where you're watching? Drop it in the comments. After Prohibition ended in 1933, a lot of men who'd gotten rich off illegal liquor suddenly had a problem. The ocean of money dried up overnight. But gangsters don't retire. They pivot. Dutch Schultz was one of them. And he moved through obstacles the way a boot moves through slush. Heavy, ugly, and without asking permission. Schultz had money, he had muscle, and he had something more dangerous than both. Connections that could turn cops into couriers and judges into janitors. He could make law enforcement a weapon, pointed wherever he needed it. When he looked at Harlem in the mid-1930s, he didn't see culture. He didn't see the Renaissance glow still hanging in the air, or the music pouring out of every basement and ballroom. He saw cash flow, he saw gambling, he saw protection rackets, he saw a neighborhood that could be squeezed. Territory in New York was never just geography. It was permission. Permission to operate, permission to collect, permission to exist without constant disruption. That permission could be bought with bribes. He negotiated through middlemen or enforced with violence. Schultz preferred the last option. His crews started moving into Harlem like they owned the deed, pressuring runners, leaning on operators, making it clear you either pay up or you pay in other ways. But here's what Schultz didn't account for. Harlem wasn't just a market. It was an identity project. The neighborhood had spent a decade proving that black excellence wasn't theoretical, that it could fill a room, lift a ceiling, and make the rest of the city come north for what it couldn't create on its own. You don't squeeze a place like that without pushback. And the man holding the line, he didn't need a gun or a crew of 50. He just needed a reputation and a razor. The Savoy Ballroom wasn't just a place to dance. It was a statement, opened in 1926. It stretched an entire block on Lenox Avenue between 141st and 141st. 2 bandstands, a floor so polished it looked like glass, and something rare for 1930s America. It was integrated. White, black, brown, didn't matter. If you could move, you were welcome. That alone made it dangerous. Because in a country built on separation, a room where people shared a floor, shared air, shared joy, that was a threat to the whole system. It said, in the simplest possible way, we don't need your permission to be human. On any given night, the Savoy was electric. The bandstand elevated like a pulpit, dancers moving in waves, feet snapping in rhythm so tight it sounded like one heartbeat. The smell of sweat and powder and bootleg liquor. The unspoken rules enforced not by bouncers, but by 1,000 eyes watching, making sure nobody started trouble. Because trouble here didn't stay personal. In a neighborhood where disrespect was a daily ration, served by landlords, employers, cops, certain spaces became sacred. The Savoy was one of them. It was proof. Proof that Harlem could create something the rest of the city couldn't buy, steal, or replicate. And when you disrespect that proof, when you walk into that sacred space and humiliate one of its greatest artists in front of 500 people, you're not just insulting a man. You're testing a boundary, and boundaries in Harlem were enforced by men who didn't wear badges. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. You're about to see why one night changed everything. By 1935, Duke Ellington wasn't just a band leader. He was a diplomat in a tuxedo. He'd played for presidents and gangsters, for high society and hole-in-the-wall joints. But he moved through a country that hated him with a smile that never cracked, a posture that never slouched, and a level of excellence that made it impossible to ignore him. That kind of dignity wasn't natural. It was strategy. Because in Jim Crow America, a black man, no matter how talented, no matter how famous, had to be twice as good and half as loud just to survive. One wrong word, one flash of anger, one moment where the mask slipped, and the headlines would bury you. So Duke learned to control everything, his face, his tone, his reactions. He wore calm like armor. But that armor had a cost. It meant swallowing things. It meant smiling through insults. It meant playing for crowds that saw you as entertainment, not as human. And on that night at the Savoy, when champagne hit his face mid-song, Duke did what he'd been trained to do his entire life. He froze. He calculated. He waited to see what the room would allow. But here's the thing about public humiliation. It's never just about the person it happens to. When a man like Duke Ellington gets disrespected in front of 500 people, it's a message, a reminder, a test. It says, "This is what we think of you. This is what we think of all of you." The room got reminded, violently, of what the outside world thought of it. And someone in that room decided that reminder wouldn't stand. The table near the bandstand had been loud all night. 4 men, expensive suits that didn't fit right. The kind you buy when you've got new money and no taste. Loud laughter that cut through the music like broken glass. They weren't there for the dancing. They weren't there for Duke. And they were there to be seen. The one in the center, later stories would call him Vic the Blade. Though whether that was his real name or just what the streets decided to remember, had the energy of a man testing boundaries. Loud voice, wandering eyes. The kind of guy who thought money bought him permission to do whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted. He'd been drinking since they walked in, expensive champagne. The kind you pop to make noise, not to enjoy. And then mid-song, he stood up, bottle in hand, grin on his face, his crew watching, half amused, half nervous. He shook it, once, twice, then he aimed it at the stage, at Duke Ellington. The spray exploded, golden liquid catching the stage lights, arcing through the air like a slow-motion insult. It hit Duke square in the face, soaked his collar, dripped onto the piano keys. The music stopped. Not a fade, not a gentle ending, a full stop, like someone cut the power to the room. 500 people inhaled at once. Duke stood there, frozen, liquid dripping from his jaw, his hands still hovering over the keys. His face blank. Not from shock, but from calculation, because he knew what happened next could end him. Vic laughed. His boys laughed. The room didn't, because in a city that rationed disrespect daily, from cops, from landlords, from every white face that looked through you like you were invisible, this was different. This was a public execution of dignity. And in the back of the room, a man in a tailored suit pushed off the wall and started walking. "What's the weather like where you are? Sunny? Rainy? Let me know below." Bumpy Johnson didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The way the crowd felt him before they saw him, a shift in the air, a ripple through the bodies packed shoulder to shoulder on that dance floor. People turned, then they moved. Not because someone told them to, because they knew real authority doesn't shout. It moves, and the room rearranges itself. Bumpy walked slow, deliberate. His suit was tailored to perfection, dark, sharp, expensive in a way that didn't scream but whispered. His face was calm, almost bored, but his eyes were locked on that table near the bandstand. He moved like water through stone. By the time he reached Vic's table, a circle had formed, not planned, just instinct. People knew when to give space. Vic was still laughing, still riding the high of his little performance. His crew noticed Bumpy first, their smiles fading, shoulders tensing. But Vic? He was too drunk, too confident, too stupid to read the room. Bumpy stopped, didn't sit, didn't lean, just stood there, hands loose at his sides, and then he reached into his jacket, not fast, not dramatic, slow, controlled. What came out wasn't a gun. It was a straight razor, not the kind barbers used for clean shaves and small talk, the kind that folded into your palm and opened with a flick, the kind that required you to get close, close enough to see a man's eyes, close enough to smell his fear. Guns create distance, blades collapse it. Vic's smile finally cracked. Bumpy tilted his head, voice low and surgical. You just disrespected the Duke, in my city, at my table. Vic opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to threaten, maybe to laugh it off. He shouldn't have. Bumpy didn't wait for an answer. The razor moved before Vic could blink. Not wild, not angry, precise. A thin line across Vic's cheek, just deep enough to bleed, just controlled enough to send a message. Vic jerked back, hand flying to his face. His fingers came away red. His crew half stood, hands moving toward their waistbands, but they froze when Bumpy's eyes shifted to them. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. You reach for that, and you don't leave here walking. The razor was still in his hand, still open, still ready. Vic's boys sat back down. The room was silent except for the sound of Vic's breathing, fast, shallow, panicked. Blood dripped onto his expensive suit, onto the table, onto the floor that had seen 1,000 nights of joy and was now witnessing something else entirely. Bumpy leaned in close, close enough that only Vic could hear him clearly, though the people nearest caught pieces. Yadra, that's a warning. You go back to wherever you came from, and you tell them Harlem ain't for sale. You tell them the Duke plays here in peace. You tell them if I see you north of 110th Street again, I won't stop at your face. He straightened, folded the razor with one hand, smooth, practiced, like closing a book. Then he turned to Duke, still standing at the piano, still frozen. Bumpy nodded, once, a gesture so small it could have been missed. But Duke saw it. Permission, protection, respect. Duke exhaled, sat back down, wiped his face with a handkerchief someone handed him, and then he started playing again. The band followed, hesitant at first, then stronger. The music swelled, the room exhaled. Dancers returned to the floor, though their eyes kept drifting back to that table where Vic sat, bleeding, humiliated, and very much alive. The Bumpy walked back to his spot against the wall. The night continued, but everyone there knew a line had been drawn in blood. Smash that like button if you think Bumpy did what had to be done, or drop a comment if you think he went too far. Here's where it gets interesting. You go looking for this story in the official records, police reports, newspaper archives, court documents, and you find nothing. No arrest, no incident report, no mention in the New York Times or the Amsterdam News. No hospital admission for a man with a slashed face. No investigation into an assault at one of Harlem's most famous ballrooms. It's like it never happened. But if you talk to people who were there, or who knew people who were there, the story comes back consistent. The details might shift. Some say it was champagne, others say whiskey. Some say the cut was on the cheek, others say the neck. Some remember the name Vic, others remember something else. But the shape of the story stays the same. So what do you do with that as an investigator? You ask, why is there no paper trail? Fear of retaliation. Nobody wanted to be the one who called the cops on Bumpy Johnson or on Dutch Schultz's crew. Police indifference, or worse, police cooperation with the very people causing the trouble. Payoffs that kept incidents off the books. And the simple, brutal reality that in 1935, Harlem, you handled your business internally because the law wasn't there to protect you. In true crime, what isn't documented can be as revealing as what is. The absence of records tells you how power actually worked, not through courts and badges, but through fear, loyalty, and in the understanding that some things were settled face to face. But here's the part that makes this story complicated. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a hero in a cape. He was an enforcer, a protector, yes, but protection and predation often wore the same suit. The same system that funded rent and coal also funded violence. The same man who defended Duke Ellington also ran rackets that squeezed the neighborhood. Community defense and organized crime weren't opposites. They were twins. That's the truth folklore doesn't like to admit. In Harlem, stories don't die. They change clothes. A thing happens on a corner, in a back room, under a bandstand, and by the time it reaches the next block, it's gained a timestamp. A villain with a nickname and a line of dialogue that feels too perfect to be invented. Outsiders hear those stories and call them folklore. Locals hear them and call them maps. Because that night at the Savoy, whether every detail is courtroom accurate or not, became a boundary marker. It said, this far and no farther. It said, you can come to Harlem for the music, for the culture, for the joy we create. But you will not disrespect us in our own house. That's why the story survived. Not because of the blood, not because of the razor, but because of what it meant. Protection in that era was never abstract. It wasn't a policy or a press release. It was intimate. It required proximity. It required someone willing to stand close enough to be harmed too. Bumpy Johnson, for all his contradictions, represented that idea. That dignity in a city built to grind it out of you was worth defending with the only tools available. The razor wasn't just a weapon. It was a refusal to swallow humiliation, a refusal to let Harlem's greatest artists be treated like props, a refusal to let outsiders believe they could take without consequence. In a room full of people trained to bow their heads and swallow insults, just to survive another day, somebody finally stood, and the room remembered. That's case one. If you want more stories like this, stories they don't teach in school, subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment. What case should I cover next? And remember, Harlem wasn't for sale. It still isn't.